Okay, so thank you again for having me at this webinar. It's really a privilege to be able to speak on sort of the approach, the Canadian approach to the regulation of natural health products within which we would find botanical medicines. So in terms of just a general overview as to how I would go about this is to kind of reflect on the regulatory framework, which provides us with certain provisions in how we approach the safety of NHPs, licensing requirements briefly, and then to end off with some of the regulatory challenges and opportunities based on my time with the directorate. While I do not have a disclaimer, I would again recognize that these views are entirely that of my own and do not necessarily reflect that of Health Canada. So NNHPD, which is the Natural and Non-Prescription Health Products Directorate, is a federal regulatory body responsible for natural health products, non-prescription drugs, as well as disinfectant drugs in Canada. Our role is to ensure that Canadians do have ready access to NHPs, non-prescriptions, and disinfectant drugs. For those of you who are aware of when the regulations came into force in 2004, part of that role is respecting the freedom of choice and philosophical diversity when it comes to how we administer our mandate. So in terms of what NHPs are actually defined as drugs under the Food and Drug Act. So that's where the authority essentially flows from. It is important to note that NHPs, while drugs, are viewed separately from drugs which are regulated or synthetic non-naturally occurring drugs, which are regulated under the Food and Drug regulations. And the distinction for that allows one to approach standards a little bit differently. In terms of the classic drug development model, which would apply on the food and drug regulation side, you do not necessarily see that with NHPs. And that's just because of the wide range of substances that can be found in NHPs. So if we look more closely at our regulatory framework, the natural health product regulations in of itself defines what is an NHP, both from a structural perspective as well as from a functional perspective. It includes provisions for what we would require in terms of supporting a product license application. And that's a key aspect of our framework as well, in that in order for any product to be sold legally in Canada, there has to be a product license application that's been reviewed by the department and found to be sufficient with respect to safety, efficacy, and quality. At that point, then it is authorized, and these products would bear a specific number on the label to signify to consumers that they have been acceptable. Similarly, we have provisions for site licensing, which would relate to the premises within which some of these activities are conducted. Good manufacturing practice, clinical trials, packaging and labeling. These are all provisions and a suite of provisions that exist within the regulations. So when we talk about safety, it's not to look at just one facet of it. I think it's very, very important to understand that all of these elements are important. And this has been shown by some of the earlier speakers when they really looked at quality requirements or some of the quality considerations. So I'll just return back to the definition of a natural health product then. And here you can find it's a very, very wide range. I guess the simple way of looking at it is if it's naturally occurring, if it can be found in nature, there's a good chance that it would meet the definition of a natural health product. And here we would find the classical things like the herbal ingredients, plant material, extracts thereof, and including isolates from there. You would also find traditional medicines here, which is one of the unique aspects of our regulatory framework in that it allows for the licensing of things not based strictly and only on scientific evidence. It does allow the leveraging of other forms of evidence, textbook, references to traditional use. So the documented oral traditions can, in fact, be a very, very good tool in terms of the licensing of products. If I look at then, there are obviously certain things that are natural, but for one reason or another, are not entertained as natural health products. So this again is a way of, while it's also been mentioned, while it's natural, there is this presumption of safety. Yes, that may be true for certain things, but not for all. And it's always that nuance. So there's certain substances that, while naturally occurring, have been carved out as these would require higher level of evidence or would require further scrutiny. So anything that would, as an example, something like tobacco is a natural occurring substance, but tobacco itself is not regulated under our regulations. Nicotine, on the other hand, would be, and that's just because nicotine does have the, can be used in the health context of smoking cessation products, whereas for tobacco in of itself, that wouldn't be the case. Anything that would be injected as well, regardless of whether it's natural or synthetic, would not be regulated under our framework just based on the safety concerns that may occur in terms of with that route of administration. And under our regulatory framework, anything that would be sold under a prescription, again, would be excluded. So if we then consider the functional definition, I think it's important to note that it is a wide range. These are products that are intended to be used for the diagnosis, treatment, mitigation, or prevention of disease, disorder, or abnormal physical state in humans. The subsequent definition also is in terms of restoring or correcting organic function. Again, the emphasis is in humans, and that is something that is top of mind when looking at the actual evidence of safety, is that you do need a sufficient body of information that is derived from the human experience, whether that would be in terms of clinical trials or history of use, but it really should reflect exposures that are consistent with what has been seen in humans. So if we look at broadly in terms of the various application types that may come forward, then we do have non-traditional applications. And in a non-traditional application, the emphasis is really on having scientific evidence to support the safety, the efficacy of those products. In terms of a traditional application, the scientific evidence is really more around safety, but not necessarily a driver for the efficacy. And I keep talking about safety and efficacy because in a regulatory framework such as ours, we wouldn't necessarily separate those two. And there are actually three pillars in terms of quality as well. So what Health Canada has done is we also do have our published monographs, and the monographs serve as a standard for industry to use to support your product. The monographs would set out the requirements that one must meet in order to satisfy the safety and efficacy of that substance. So these are tools that can be used to support an application, and if used in that way, then the applicant is not required to submit any information of their own other than with respect to the quality of their product. Where the applicant seeks to go outside of the monograph for whatever reason, whether it would be related to the claims, permissible dosage forms, route of admin, all of that then should be substantiated by the applicant. So the onus in terms of licensing and satisfying those requirements is on the applicant. This shifts once a product's been licensed, where should the regulator need to take action against an authorized product, the onus is really on the regulator to demonstrate why it may no longer be safe. So when we look at efficacy requirements, then there is this commensurate with the type of claim. So the evidence standards then are tailored dependent on the severity or the seriousness of the condition for which the product may be intended for. So for something that is minor, then textbook epidemiological studies might be appropriate. For something that is more serious, then you may require 2 phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. And this is all part of ensuring that the efficacy of the product there is certainty or there is some confidence around that, because we always contemplate what are the consequences should that product not work. So that's also an aspect of really understanding the safety of these products. So severity and seriousness of the disease or condition needs to be reflected. The impact of the product performing less than anticipated, and also use in various subpopulations, particularly where the product is intended to be used in a vulnerable subpopulation, such as infants or pregnant or breastfeeding. A different or higher level of evidence is certainly necessary. So we wouldn't necessarily extrapolate into these subpopulations for the obvious reasons that they are afforded more protection and because of the uncertainty that may exist there. We also consider the inherent risks of the medicinal ingredients themselves, and this goes back to some of the talks as to the toxicity and specific constituents that may be present, where there's a need to control for these. In terms of at the end of the review, what ultimately makes its way onto the product shelf is a product with a label. And the label is that key piece that allows the consumer to interact with that product. It really directs the actions and how those products should be taken. So when we look at safety, we often have to contemplate to what extent does labeling actually help mitigate the concerns. And in some cases, it may be insufficient for labeling to be the vehicle to address those. And where that is the case, we have to kind of think of some of the considerations that we have in our framework, which afford certain ingredients to be to have prescription status or to be listed on the prescription drug list. And one of the key principles there is the need for a practitioner intervention, whether it be in monitoring, oversight, or prescribing. That may be a factor in whether something is appropriate to be regulated as a natural health product, because the premise of a natural health product is something that is appropriate for self-selection and self-medicated. Also, there might be instances where the level of uncertainty regarding the drug and its adverse effects, how it works, may simply be too great for one to entertain having it in sort of this space where consumers can freely self-select without the oversight of a learned intermediary. So again, these are factors that we reflect upon when authorizing or reviewing a product license application. As I mentioned a bit earlier, there is also the quality component, and I can't, add much more to what's already been stated, in that without quality, essentially, you have nothing to go on. Without knowing what is actually in the product, it's kind of hard to develop any way of mitigating risk, because essentially your unknowns are simply too great. So one of the, in terms of broad quality requirements that we have for NHPs, and particularly for botanicals as well, is the identity testing. So this would relate more to the raw material as well as to the finished product. We also have purity testing for microbial, chemical, and other contaminants. And quantification. Some of this can be done by input, others may be done through the use of marker compounds or actives. And this is always dependent on the type of substance, whether it would be considered an active or a marker, and whether there's also a need to control for some of these other constituents that may be of particular concern. I'll just shift gears a little bit into sort of transitioning us into some of the challenges with the framework. There's always been a need to be more efficient, and we continue to develop ways and processes to administer our mandate in a more efficient manner. So as I mentioned, there are monographs that we use to expedite the licensing of product license applications. And over the years, we've developed various classes that allow us to do this. Class 1, where we are able to essentially, render a regulatory decision within 10 days. And Class 3, which requires us to review evidence that has been submitted by the applicant, which we render a regulatory decision within 180 days. And in doing so, there are some challenges in terms of just workload and being able to look into certain things as well as we would like to on certain occasions, and still meet those timelines. So whenever issues may arise, that may require us to look further, which means we may miss some of these targets. And whenever you're missing targets, that creates some further pressures to try and find ways to address that. In terms of some of the regulatory challenges, I think quality is an obvious one and a continued one in all of the spaces. And it can be just the basic things as to how does one routinely identify the substance, how does one guard against substitution or adulteration. And then the other considerations that come in terms of an actual assessment when looking at our paper-based review and trying to determine, particularly among extracts, when is an extract sufficiently comparable to what we've known to be safe or efficacious, especially, again, as you employ different solvents or solvent systems and devices and processes. These are all considerations that as a regulator, we need to factor into our assessment. The other aspect that I would say is the natural health products is a program, and it's a program that has various entities, each of which are independent, yet are integrated in order to inform the other. So when we look at pre-market review, which is the area that I'm responsible for, once a product, there are certain things that we may uncover during pre-market review, which may then feed into our post-licensing actions and follow-up, or may also inform compliance and enforcement. And then there's the post-market surveillance piece too, which again, you use all of that information to inform the other elements of your program. Ultimately, product safety is a shared responsibility, and the consumer is also in this piece. So what I like to end off in is in terms of how do we engage the public? How do we understand what an informed public looks like? And part of that may be for the public to even understand how do products get authorized. At times there's the perception that, these products are being tested by Health Canada, which may not be accurate. We do testing on the post-market side, but those are complaint-driven or those are signal-driven. Also, when it comes to informed self-selection and self-medicating, what does that look like from a consumer perspective? Because the consumer base may not be as monolithic as we may approach it. And what does accessibility look like? Does accessibility mean to a specific product or products that are beneficial for a specific claim? And then how do we measure product or process efficiencies on our end? So I will end there, and hopefully I haven't gone over my time, and I'm happy to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bafi-Yeboa. That's wonderful. I think now we have an idea of how the regulatory environment in Canada handles safety information. So we can attend to at least only one question because of the time factor. If there's one burning question, I don't see any so far. If we don't have any question at this time, I would like us to move on to the last presentation so that we can leave the questions to the very end. And our last presentation is by none other than Professor Katerere, our host. He's going to tell us about Out of Africa Herbal Medicine Overview. Take it on, David.